welcome everybody to the Artist Book Library at Tycoon Contemporary. For those of you who don't know, we have a great art space over there with two exhibitions on right now, Cyberpunk and Very Natural Actions. So please go see the exhibitions while they're on view. And this right here is our Artist Book Library. We have over 1,000 books of publications by artists, mostly from local practitioners, regional, and some international as well. And as you can tell, we're also use this space to host live events, programming, and also, of course, share the space with our fellow art organizations here in Hong Kong. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we're doing here in the library, and I encourage you to, besides going to Tycoon Contemporary, a little bit of a plug here. In January 16th through the 19th, we'll be hosting our second annual Booked Hong Kong Art Book Fair, and we'll be including AA and many other great publishers and art organizations, and they will have a full list, again, of programs, performances, talks, and displays, as well as a special project called Overbooked, and that will last a little bit longer and will have its own programs as well. So I encourage you. We'll have more information very soon on our website and on our own on the book fair's own mini site. So I encourage you to. We'll have more information, take a look, and hopefully we'll see you again in January. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to John Tain of AAA, and then he'll introduce our guest of honor, David Morris.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for welcoming us into this space. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this talk. I had prepared a statement, but I think I'm going to wing it. Kind of inspired by Ozge, actually, because last night as we were going home, Ozge kind of turned to me and was like, David's a really nice guy, our speaker, David Morris. And I was like, I could only agree full-heartedly. And so that's one reason to be here with David, is because he's a really nice guy. But also because David is part of a team. He's a research fellow and editor at Afterall, based in London at Central St. Martin, where he is particularly involved with the Afterall exhibition Histories series. And in addition to that, he is a researcher who has worked in areas of artistic research, education, and exhibitions, all of which AA has been very interested in from its beginning. And also, especially when they are in tandem with questions of experimental and collective practices, both of which also AA is also interested in. So there's lots of shared resonances between our interests. This kind of interest in collective practices and experimental practices also extends into his editorial work. So he is the co-editor with Sylvain L'Étranger of Schizo Culture, which came out published by Semiotext in 2014. And then more recently, Artist to Artist, Independent Art Festivals in Chiang Mai 1992 to 1998, which was co-edited by David Tay and the two Davids, David Tay and David Morris. Most recently, Festac 77, which he is not an editor of, but you worked very extensively with Chimurenga, the collective based in South Africa that did edit the volume. Both this and Artist to Artist are available in the back. Osuke wanted me to remind you, for sale, for anyone who wants to pick up a copy. We have them at slightly discounted rates, so it's a good chance to pick up these books if you would like. And I think after you'll hear David speak about them, I'm sure you'll go running to the back and pick them up. But yes, speaking a little more seriously, I want to say that this is a real pleasure for AA to be able to invite David here on his first trip to Hong Kong. because this is a great chance for us to kind of think about the relationship that we've been, Afterall, and Asia Archive has been developing since early 2018, I think. Well, actually, 2017 was like when we all kind of met up, but then 2018, we had the opportunity to talk about the work on exhibition histories. And so, it's been this immense honor to be able to work with Afterall on this series, which began in 2010 with a volume on new art, looking at an exhibition Upleserschreven, and when attitudes become form. And now Festac 77 is the 10th volume in the series. And the series has really helped define, I think, how people think about exhibition histories. And of course, this is an area that Asia Archive is very much interested in within the Asian context. And so, in addition to these two volumes, we're working as series editors with them and co-publishers. And so the next volume that we'll be putting out is actually looking at Shanghai in the year 2000, so uncooperative contemporaries. And that will come out next year. Yeah. Oh, really? Spring 2020? Wow. Spring, summer. Okay. You're being very, optimistic. Okay, so... so it's been great to work with Afterall on this series, and looking forward to hearing what David has to say. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to him for addressing the question, is the exhibition a festival, and other questions in exhibition histories?
Okay. Is that working okay? All hear me? Well, thank you. Very, very kind introduction. Thank you for that. And also thank you to all of the organizing team. It's really a pleasure to be here. All extremely nice people as well, I would underline. So I'm appreciative of all of that. So my presentation is in a sort of, I'm going to try and do two things at once. So one thing is to talk about these two publications that I've worked on over the last couple of years. And the other sort of thread of it is this question or proposition, is the exhibition a festival? So I'm going to go into that a little bit more as we go. I would say the last month has been, should we say, it's been affected by my being hit by a car, which is why my wrist is in this cast. So I'm fine. It's been well patched up and well looked after, but it means I haven't been able to write over the past, 3 weeks or so, which is a very interesting writing constraint, which I would recommend if you've got any kind of writer's block. Writing with your left or typing with your left, it makes you think in a different way. So the presentation is a reflection of that, and it's a good opportunity to, in the spirit of festival, present in a slightly looser fashion. So I would very much welcome interruptions or questions from the floor at any time. We'll have a Q&A towards the end, but please do feel free to interrupt. I will present, but I'm happy to be diverted. And so, to come, my guiding proposition draws from the fact that the last decade has seen growing attention given to the sites and situations through which art becomes public, exhibitions being one of those situations. Whereas comparatively little work and attention has been given to festivals. And this is in spite of their importance for the development of contemporary art networks and practices, in particular geographies, including Southeast Asia, and also for particular disciplines and types of practice, including artist film, performance. And this is also, notwithstanding the kind of many legacies of world festivals, self-described world festivals across the last century, in the name of projects of Pan-Africanism and also anti-imperialism and transnational peace, friendship, and solidarity. So these are some of the things I'll be touching upon in what follows. And also, if we have time, I'm interested in a kind of critical reading of the Biennale as a contemporary art exhibition as well. So one of the sort of conduits of the quote-unquote global turn in the art field, particularly post 89 and through the 90s, is the Biennale, or this is the story that we're often told, and I'm interested in how the festival form kind of interacts or like complicates that set of histories. And I must give credit to Antonio Jebe, the sort of lead editor and organizer of Chimurenga, for alerting me to this record, which is my my image or emblem for this talk. You can find it on YouTube. We can listen to a little bit of later if we have time. And I would strongly encourage seeking it out. It's an incredible recording. And this was recorded at one of the festivals that I'll be touching upon later. But before we go to where we're going, a little bit about where I'm coming from. And as John said, I work at Afterall, which is a publisher and research centre headquartered in London with institutional partners in other parts of the world. And so we're based at an art school called Central St Martin's, which is part of University of the Arts London. Afterall was founded in the late 90s, 98, 99, depending on who you ask. And it was founded by an artist called Mark Lewis and a curator called Charles Escher. And it was, in the beginning, it was a journal, and it was founded as a way to develop different sort of techniques and practices of writing around contemporary art. And over the years, it's developed various other publishing and research activities. And these, I wanted to find an image of our office, which is here. And this is at the close, actually, of the process of this book. If I look a bit bleary-eyed, I'm burning the midnight oil there. But I was blessed with the presence of Som Sucharat Supaparinya, who's a Chiang Mai-based artist and one of the contributors to this book. So this is us looking at kind of proofs and drafts and working through some things. So these are some of the publications that Afterall produces. So a few years after it began as a journal, it began producing books, and the One Work series is one of those. And it takes a view of an artist's practice or a set of questions around an artist's work through the lens of one of their artworks. So this is the book on David Hammond's Blizzard Ball Sale that Elena Filipovic wrote and came out very recently. And then another of the publication strands is the Critical Readers series, which these are two of the very early editions on art in Eastern and Central Europe, East Art Map, Art and Social Change, which is soon to be republished in Portuguese in collaboration with MASP in Sao Paulo. And there are various other readers and two in the works on art and psychedelia and art and autonomy in particular. So these have developed in the last sort of decade and a half of Afterall's existence. And as John mentioned, in the last decade, so in 2010, the exhibition Histories series was begun. And the sort of guiding premise of that was a different approach to histories of art. And so basically the aim was a shift of focus, so to move away from the idea of the image of an artist working in their studio, this moment of creation, towards the moment at which an art enters a kind of public situation. So when the art becomes public and it enters a set of relationships, whether they be interpersonal relationships or relationships with other works. So that was the kind of guiding principle of the series, and these are the first 9 books, the 9th being Chiang, My Social Installation, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they can be broadly grouped into a set of concerns which run through various of them. So one being experimentation with the exhibition form, which comes from the first book on When Attitudes Become Form and Oblast Schreven, and can also be seen in Exhibition as Social Intervention, which is about a public art program in Chicago in the early 90s, the sort of process-based public art project come exhibition. It can also be seen in Lucy Lippard's number shows, and tracing her own sort of trajectory from conceptualism to feminism, this book here. Another through thread is these kind of moments of rearticulation of the global, the quote-unquote global. And so this, there's 2 books, Making Art Global, one on the Havana Biennale of 1989, and the other on Magicien de la Terre. And both of these books, in their different ways, try to analyze this much commented upon 89 moment and what came afterwards, how these 2 national situations articulated the emergent global in different ways. And then there's also in that line the book on the 1998 Sao Paulo Biennale, which very much looks to that exhibition as a kind of rearticulation of art history and exhibition history through a Brazilian lens, so through the concept of anthropophagia or cannibalism. And then the final kind of through thread, which brings me up to CMSI, Chiang Mai Social Installation, is artist-initiated projects. So whether it be Hamilton, Passmore and Alloway in 1957, and this book, An Exhibit, on the bottom right there, 2 artists and a writer producing this kind of participatory environment in the context of 1950s London, through to APTA, which is an initiative in Moscow in the early 80s, artists organizing happenings and kind of what they called anti-shows in their apartments in the outdoors, to Chiang Mai Social Installation, this series of festivals in the 1990s in North Thailand, and their kind of the network of artist-led initiatives that surrounded it. And so I mentioned Afterall as a research centre, and just to give a kind of snapshot of what that means, because as well as the publications, Exhibition Histories is produced in tandem with a kind of events and a program of events and symposia. Regular events we organise in London, most recently with Fred Rukun from Rungrupa, and we do a couple of those a year, but also semi-regular or occasional symposia and larger scale events. And so this is an event called Symposium that happened in Melbourne in late 2016, if I remember. The date will be there, so I might have got that slightly wrong. And this was, as well as this edition of the journal, kind of a testing ground for some of the ideas that ultimately became the Chiang Mai Social Installation book. So Simon Soon's essay on CMSI appeared in this edition of Afterall Journal, and the symposium in Melbourne also invited a number of speakers to kind of engage with the questions that were circling around, you know, how to formulate a book on this particular topic, these festivals, and all the questions that they throw up for exhibition histories and the wider field of practice. Yeah. Is this better? Oh yeah. Yeah, I can hear that better myself. Okay. So now that I am amplified, yeah, a little bit of the afterlife of Chiang Mai Social Installation as well. So to follow that through thread, this was an event organized in Chiang Mai at Wat Tamong, one of the important sites for the festivals, and this was organized in collaboration with Som, who we met before, and was a discussion of you know, the themes and issues the book raised in the context of the Thai art scene and the situation of Chiang Mai and Thailand in 2018, which was when this occurred. And then again, on the occasion of this edition of Afterall, issue 46, we organised the launch. There was a launch event of both this journal edition and the CMSI book. This photo is a stage invasion by Li Wen, who entered our discussion unexpectedly and very interestingly. Li Wen was a participant in CMSI. His work also graces the cover of this edition of Afterall, which also features an essay by Chung Dai, who is here, and is a collaborator at Asia Art Archive as well. And so all of this to say that this kind of work proceeds through a very sort of detailed and very, very necessary set of interrelations and collaborations between different sort of different people. So it's a many-handed thing, and I think when the research centre works at its best, it's able to connect the dots between these different activities and publications and projects. And that brings me to Festac, which is the latest title in our series. Was an enormous amount of work. It was led by Chimurenga, Cape Town-based collective and organisation, and Ntone Jabe, who I mentioned before, and is very much the product of an enormously intensive process of research by Chimurenga over 5 years or more. So they've been working on Festac for a long time, and we sort of have been in conversation with them for the last couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years now, on the subject of Festac. But I think it was clear from the outset that this book or this shared interest in Festac would never be able to materialize in one of the books in the format that we have set up thus far. And so, as you can see, this is a very different animal altogether, a very different kind of book, which really was a response to the demands of the material. And we might be able to pick up on that point a bit later on. The collaboration with Chimurenga also dates back to, Chimurenga were a contributor to Afterall Journal some years ago. This is issue 43, which came out in 2017. And they produced this kind of fold-out insert as we invited them to produce an artist insert for that edition, and this was what they came up with, this kind of like gatefold set of maps, which has no direct relation to Festac, but was the start of another set of conversations and certainly the start of a collaborative relationship. So again, there is an interrelation or a backstory there. But this returns me to the guiding question of this session. So I mean, it's, I guess, worth noting that the most recent books are both about festivals, and so I think that gives occasion to reflect on this question. And my guiding premise, I suppose, what I want to suggest is that the exhibition is a festival. That's my claim. Maybe sounds strange, maybe not, but hopefully I'll be able to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So I don't mean saying the exhibition is festival is not a critical statement and more a descriptive one. And I'm not so much saying that exhibitions have become more festival-like in recent years, though that's, I think, an observation that can be made as well. But more that I think the concept of festival may be useful in order to adopt, in order to understand and make sense of the recent history of exhibition making, and also to think about exhibition practice now and in the future. I mentioned the guiding idea of exhibition histories being the moment at which art becomes public, and so in order to explain a little bit what I mean about festival, I just give a recap of that. So paraphrasing Lucy Steeds, who's my colleague and really the guiding force of exhibition histories within Afterall, she has remarked that, so for her, an exhibition is almost precisely not about objects or individuals, nor to treat the exhibition as a curatorial thing, but to see it instead as a collective experience and discursive event with historical potential for a future place and time. So that's me paraphrasing Lucy in a conversation she had with Beatrice von Bismarck and Benjamin Meyer Kramer. And I like this definition very much because I think it allows a certain latitude in what we can talk about as exhibitions and what we can understand exhibition practices as doing. And so I would say that if exhibitions becoming festival has a history, it runs in step with wider shifts of practice in geography and develops also in correspondence with broader economic forces and sociopolitical forces as a growing literature within sociology and like urbanism in particular on festivalization would attest. But that, I think, is one definition of festival, but I mean, perhaps maybe not so much the most interesting one. So, of course, festivals are susceptible as biennales or many other forms of, co-option in very commercial city branding exercises and spectacularized cultural forms. But again, this is one of many possible readings of festival, and I think we'll see some of the many multifaceted ways of understanding this concept. And so what does it mean to say the exhibition is a festival? And I think there are at least two claims here. I'm going to spool back because these two points don't relate to the two things I'm about to say, so to avoid confusion. The first is that I think it's a claim about what can be included within the field of exhibition history. So what gets to be talked about within the histories of how contemporary art is experienced and understood. And I would suggest that including festivals includes some advantages, namely first an expansion of geographic scope, which is something we can talk about. Secondly, registering the diversity and sophistication of practices of making art public beyond a kind of lineage of Western modernism. And thirdly, an alternative set of priorities, skill sets, characteristics and potentials, and that's more thinking about exhibition making as practice. So that's the first claim, that festivals be integrated within exhibition histories. And the second claim is descriptive. So, and I guess more strongly put, the exhibition simply is a festival, or if not quite that, they exist very closely on the same continuum. And this 2 points as a kind of like cartoon character distinction of the difference between exhibition and festival, which I think has a particular lineage and has a very, like, I don't know, residual set of common sense understandings that stand, even if most of us would probably want to disagree with these points. So the idea being that exhibitions are sites of art, narrowly understood as visual and object-based forms, whereas festivals are sites of arts, plural, or culture, multisensory, multiple, and non-art activities. So this is a kind of caricature definition of why the two things are separate, or two ends of the continuum. But I think, as most of us would agree, there's multiple problems with that separation, not least the developments within artistic practice since at least the 1950s worldwide, that have moved away from object-based and primarily visual forms, and the other sort of strand of that being the critiques of Western modernity's privileging of visuality and objecthood over performative and durational forms of practice. So there are many reasons to question a hard and fast distinction that was, maybe established in the early 20th century or even late 19th century. And the other way of kind of muddying that separation, and again, this is a kind of cartoon character set of histories going way back to the 18th and 19th centuries, is to think about exhibitions in terms of their like deep historical lineages, and following these texts cited here. So Tony Bennett's essay on the exhibitionary complex, which takes things back to the Cabinet of Curiosities and these well-known kind of historical lineages. Within that text also, he talks about how the exhibitionary complex kind of absorbed the energies of pre-modern popular gatherings and fairs, and so there is a very real sense that the two things are entangled and intertwined. And so just as much as we may say the contemporary exhibition is a lineage of an outgrowth of these kind of histories on the right, it's also a lineage of the histories on the left, and shares many of these kind of qualities and features and priorities, or at least that's my suggestion. And there's this very interesting article by George Simmel, who talks about the 1896 Berlin Trade Exhibition, and he makes this funny analogy between medieval guilds of knights who kind of became outdated by the dawn of modernity. So guilds of knights were no longer fit for purpose, but they continued as social gatherings. And he draws this connection between that and the evolution of these kind of trade exhibitions and the kind of world exhibitions of the 19th century, which I found rather fascinating. And this is a quote from him. So I won't dwell on this. This is zooming much too far back into the past than perhaps is helpful, but it's just to say that there is not one single story of how this thing we understand as exhibition came about. And although there is this kind of connecting argument that's often made between the world expos of the 19th century and the kind of global exhibition events of today, most recently in Carol A. Jones's book, The Global Work of Art, World's Fairs, Biennales, and the Aesthetics of Experience. This is a kind of well-worn narrative, but less talked about are the major world festivals of the last half of the 20th century. I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned, in the World Youth Festivals, which were kind of USSR soft power initiative, and also the great Pan-African festivals, such as Festac, and the lineage of Pan-Africanist festivals it sits within. And so that lineage runs, or at least this is an articulation that I believe Chimurenga were among the first to really claim, this kind of trajectory from 1966 in Dakar, the celebrated first Pan-African festival, which was organized under the sign of negritude and Leopold Senghor. And then this progression to Algiers in 69, which was a much more of a kind of cultural politics and gathering of liberation movements, very critical, deliberately critical of the 66 gathering in a number of ways. And then in 77, Festac, which is the kind of complex, messy, and excessive and exuberant culmination of this this lineage. And so Festac is an endless source of fascination and an endless source of kind of research and stories. I was just explaining to Ozge before we began that. So this is the book that we published this year, and that Chimurenga edited and devised and orchestrated. Orchestrated being the operative word. The music analogy runs strong through this. Yeah, absolutely, yes. And every process in this book. So say we were sourcing an image. Every conversation would lead to 50 or 100 other kind of paths of research. You know, you'd ask someone about one image. I remember, so Melvin Edwards, the US artist, was at Festac. I had to contact him over a poem that we included of Jane Cortez, who was also attendant at Festac, a very important writer, and was partner of Mel Edwards. And so I was on the phone to him, and through that discovered that he has his own archive of images of this festival, which we discovered so late in the day that we weren't even able to follow up. But it's one example of the kind of endlessness of this book. So to give a bit of background, what was Festac? It was its full title was the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, and there's an interesting reflection on this very unwieldy title by Wole Soyinka in the book. So one of the one of the expansions from 66 is that it's arts and culture, whereas the 66 festival was just art, and it's black and African rather than just black art. And there's complicated negotiations going on between these like changes in nomenclature. So one of the expansions of Festac was including North Africa within the concept of Pan-Africanism. So whereas Negritude and the 66 festival excluded the North African states from their purview, there was a big kind of almost a diplomatic incident between Senegal and Lagos in the run-up to Festac, because the Nigerian position was that it's Pan-Africanism is expansive and must be expansive in its scope, so the North African states must be included, despite not coming under the concept of negritude as defined by Senghor in the 66 festival. So this is just one of the stories, and I must be mindful not to get carried away because there are many tangents. In fact, I think Festac is a book of tangents rather than rather than the main event. The main event is somehow always eludes in the face of these many other detours. So this is the program, and two images by Ahmet Francis, who's a UK-based photographer and one of the UK delegation that went to Festac. And so Festac, it was this enormously excessive gathering. So thousands or tens of thousands of artists, writers, theatre makers, intellectuals, musicians from across Africa and the Black diaspora descended on Lagos, gathered there in early 1977 for this kind of month-long celebration extravaganza. And that is what the book tries to capture. And so one of the questions, the guiding questions of the talk, I think, is, as well as about exhibitions and festivals, how the question of history. So how does one historicize a festival, and is that different from how one speaks to and speaks of and documents the history of festivals? And in the case of Festac, it's very striking that in terms of the written record, in terms of the discourse, and particularly the scholarly discourse, there's maybe one book about Festac, which was written by a guy called Andrew Apter, who's an anthropologist, a US anthropologist, and he approaches Festac from the point of view of spectacularization of culture through oil wealth. So Festac was enormously well-resourced due to the Nigeria's newfound oil wealth of the 1970s. So there was a saying at the time that when Nigeria sneezes, America catches a cold, which reflects the shifting kind of the shifting power relations due to their striking oil in the early 70s and being able to command a very good price on the world market. So this is the focus of Andrew Apter's book, and Festac was presided over by General Obasanjo, who was a military authoritarian governor and was the latest in a succession of military rulers of Nigeria during the 70s through a succession of coups. And so there is this side of the kind of what might be described as the official side of Festac, which I would associate with this image on the right, the dignitary getting into his vehicle being opened by the soldier, a member of the Nigerian military. The kind of the top-down reading of Festac is very prominent in the kind of academic discourse, which is very limited in itself, which can be contrasted with the number of, for example, the number of records that were produced by different African musicians in the run-up to and in the wake of Festac, and many of these were also kind of self-funded records, some of which are presented in the book there. And Antonio has an extremely impressive collection. This is another one of his obsessions, is the records produced for Festac and around Festac, and these are the kind of unofficial histories of this event, presented through music of different forms. And so this image on the right also speaks to that unofficial aspect. So this is an image of Armand Francis's of one of the technicians in the exhibition hall of Festac. So Festac had an exhibition component, and this is one of the exhibits there, and this is one of the technicians cleaning this sculpture. So Festac was, as I said, the project of a long-term research program by Chimurenga, and this is one of the stopping points of that research in London. And I think to connect it to the broader question, Chimurenga's engagement with exhibition as a form, they don't, I think their approach is that the exhibition is a means to produce more research. And so in the London iteration, it was a way to gather a public around the London contingent of Festac and Festac's London stories, of which there were many. And so I will just spool on to this slide, so this is one of the spreads of the book. So what I was just moving through was some of the spreads from this book, and this is these are the photographs of Len Garrison, who was another part of the UK contingent, and during the 1970s, he was involved in the setting up of the Black Cultural Archives, which is a archive and cultural space in Brixton in southeast London. And so Festac comes at a very interesting time in his personal trajectory. So the early plans are in place, and then as part of the British delegation, he goes to Nigeria, and these are his sort of snapshots, basically, that are collected in the Black Cultural Archives collection, which we were able to reproduce in the book, and it reflects both the kind of the fact that this book, as a way of telling the story of Festac or historicizing Festac, was very much about gathering these very personal memories, very personal relationships to it. So in the absence of a kind of highly expansive academic discourse on the subject, which perhaps never quite got to what was important and special and vital about Festac, we turn to these personal histories and personal archives, and the book is certainly a kind of collective gathering of those personal relationships, and usually very intensive personal relationships with this event. And this is also a film poster that was a film of Festac was also screened in London in the year following, so it gathered another sort of afterlife that way. And I will just show you more slowly, because I skipped forward then while I was finishing my point. So these are some of the other spreads of the book. This is Nadi Kamar, photographed by Marilyn Nance, who's US photographer and part of the US delegation, and has also been a real force in convening particularly the US cast of the Festac story, and has been very much a carrier of its legacy there as well. And credit must be given to her. And this is a propos of where we are today. Chimurenga's mapping of the Afro-Asian kind of trajectories that Festac was able to convene or connect. And I won't say too much about this, except that I think it also speaks to the method that I mentioned. So this musical method. The book there is subtitled. Let me get this right. Reproduced and arranged and decomposed by Chimurenga. With and Antonio Jabe is credited with misdirections in music, and the sort of modus operandi is very much drawing from a sonic heritage, a sonic methodology. And so this map, for example, is a sample from another Chimurenga publication, an issue of the Chronic, which is the biannual newspaper that they produce, a Pan-Africanist platform of art, culture, politics, and writing. And so they sample this map from a recent issue of the Chronic, and it ends up in the book here. And there is also on the question of methodology, how one writes or thinks about this histories. There's the idea of history. I don't know, particularly with Chimurenga, I think they have a complicated and quite sophisticated relationship with acts of history and memory, which is what which is how they move through a project like this, and the memories and histories of something like Festac, and mapping its imaginary field, as Antonius put it. And I wanted to just briefly touch upon the film element of the book, because I think this is an interesting example of how they're able to blurring what history and memory do. So this is a film poster that appears in the book of the Festac Film Festival, and this was produced. This was a production from the general program of Festac. So, in true Festac style, there's no presentation of an actual film program within the ephemera and the materials that we discovered. So there is this general program where the films are kind of dispersed throughout the general kind of events of each day. So this is just one page, and you can see here the William Klein film, for example, on the Algiers Festival of '69 was actually screened in '77, like building up this lineage that I mentioned before. But they never present it in this way, or at least not that we were ever able to discover. So one of the things during the process of the book was to what happens when you put the film program together as a program. There's no one's ever credited with this programming, but actually when you put it all together, as you see in the book, it's an incredibly rich presentation of African cinema from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and as a film program in itself, extraordinarily impressive. And so presenting it as an intentional act, which is, or presenting it as a film festival, giving it a poster, giving it its due as a kind of an event, was one of the creative acts that the book brought into being. So a kind of act of reconstructive memory. And actually, one of the texts in the book was called, by Menelik Shabazz, who was also part of the UK contingent, was called the Festac Film Festival, which was written at the time in response to the film program. But again, I'm not quite sure where that title came from. So even at the time, it was understood as a film festival in some respect, and yet that's not reflected in any of the archives that we looked at. And just to return to the point about a kind of superabundance of material, these are the 10 volumes of papers produced from the Festac conference, which addressed the culture, art, philosophy, history, technology of the Black world, and many other things besides. And I believe this 10-volume set is still available from the National Theatre and the CBAAC, CBAC, which is the kind of cultural centre that houses the Festac archive there, and that's basically the only place you can find this. But there's an enormous amount more to say about Festac, but I will move on, and maybe we can loop back to it. But to retain this question of how one tells the stories or historicizes festivals within the context of exhibition histories and exhibition studies. I'll move on to this book. Very different festival, very different set of dynamics. And so this is an image from one of the final editions of Chiang Mai Social Installation. So Chiang Mai Social Installation was a sequence of artist-led festivals that happened in North Thailand between roughly 1992 and 1998. They were quite sort of grassroots initiatives, artist-organized, with very limited budgets, sort of sporadic funding, and thank you, John. Sporadic funding and organized with a heck of a lot of sort of goodwill and participation by all parties. So most of the artists who came to participate in these festivals funded their own trips, but they became a fairly extraordinary gathering point for a set of artist networks that were developing in the region in Southeast Asia during the 1990s. And so one of the things we tried to explore. Oh wow! Okay, I'm getting signaled, so I'll speed up a little. So one of the things we tried to explore in this book was the that kind of dawning sense of a contemporaneity among peers. We could pass it around actually as well. So that's one of the guiding threads. And I think, so yeah, the one thing to say is that CMSI doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's part of a constellation of festivals within the region that emerge in the 1990s in kind of, and there are many connections between these initiatives. And one of the answers to how to tell its story that we hit upon was through oral history, because the way it was primarily remembered and historicized locally was through word of mouth. So there's a small, again, quite a limited written critical response to CMSI. There's newspaper articles here and there, and it was beginning to receive its due in terms of, there was one PhD written by Tassanai Desari, who is one of the contributors to this oral history as well, and an important pioneer in historicizing these events. But we tried to reflect that existing historicization by producing an extended oral history of CMSI, and this was produced in collaboration with a great number of people and then sort of synthesized into this quite extended document, which is part of the book, which is presented in parallel with, again, the very extensive video documentation of this festival as well. And so just to speed on a bit and round up this section, or this set of questions around history and historiography, I guess, and we can then move into a Q&A. I wanted to bring up this text by Raimendo Albano, who's work is, I think, very, very instructive. So this is Raimendo Albano is a artist, critic, writer, curator. He did many things, and in this text, he sort of talks about a lineage for installational practice in the Filipino context. So he's, and you can find this text online. I really recommend searching it out. It's very interesting, and he very specifically makes the argument that these vernacular practices of the Philippines, the jeepney, the festive sort of ornamentation, must be seen as a kind of another formulation of what was happening in the work of his contemporaries, himself and his contemporaries in the 70s and 80s, and their art installations. And so drawing this kind of continuum between local aesthetic practice and the contemporary inflected languages of contemporary art, which again was one of the guiding, I think, principles of CMSI, which can be seen. So the first edition was organized in temples and cemeteries, which the organizers understood as a way to connect contemporary art with the local audience in Chiang Mai and the kind of an everyday public. So this is an example of one of the sites that they put works into. And so temples and cemeteries were chosen as existing sites of everyday aesthetic experience. And so they were, that was a way of making what they knew of contemporary art from their education in Bangkok, in Silpakorn, where they had graduated from, connecting that with more vernacular forms of kind of aesthetic. And maybe there's several more details, but I think perhaps I'll end it with this slide. So this is an image sent to me by Grace Sambo, who many of you will know, I'm sure. And it's I know very little context of this, but it's on the wall of Jatiwangi Art Factory in Indonesia, and I think very much speaks to the ethos I've been trying to express. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope we can have a conversation.
So I'm going to just open the floor up for Q&A, and maybe as a way to kind of launch the conversation, I wanted to ask a question. The title of your talk is a question itself, is the exhibition a festival? And I have a question for you, which is is the publication an archive, or is the archive a publication? Because I think, as those of you in the audience can see from the Festac volume, it in fact is a compendium or anthology of archival documents, and exclusively that. Whereas the other volume on Chiang Mai social installation is more in line with the other volumes in the exhibition history series, where there is a kind of a contextualizing essay and a set of historicizing documents. But nevertheless, it also, the core of each of the volumes has a kind of a kernel of archival documentation to give people a sense of what the exhibitions were like at the time, right? Pictures, contemporary texts, and in the case of Chiang Mai social installation, oral histories. And I was wondering if you could talk about the process of archival gathering that's part of the work of the exhibition history series, and also how the conversation for Festac volume particularly turned it into something which was exclusively archival in nature. Actually, yeah. We'll need to,
I mean, one thing I would point out, it hides it very well, but the Festac volume is a combination of newly commissioned material and archival material. It's just the new material also looks like archival material, so it's been sort of over photocopied 100 times and sort of manipulated. So there is, again, this blurriness between history as sort of document and fact, and memory as a kind of, I don't know, archive of experience. And a very personal archive in a lot of sense. I mean, one of the challenges of both these books was the sort of messiness and the many difficulties with people as archive, which is, has been the guiding principle of both the books in their different ways through oral history and through these personal archives. But engaging in that way is a much more it gives memory a much greater weight, and memory is of course sort of faulty and slippy and often contradictory. I mean, I think with Festac kind of demanded an archival approach much more strongly, just because of its enormous expanse. In a way, any attempt to synthesize would be doomed. And it was never really the idea. It was clear from the outset to sort of make the book about Festac, and certainly this is the starting point of the sort of potentially hundreds of books that hopefully will follow about this extraordinarily complex event. So it's a series of, and Tony described it as a mixtape at one point, or even a scrapbook. It's a moving through of a set of motifs that the festival set up. And I think using the archival documentation is a way of getting quite directly to what that, or I mean the archival and the semi-archival and the non-archival but looks archival, these kind of different registers, as a way of getting more directly to that kind of to that set of reference points. Like it's a way to go directly to the thing rather than trying to sort of synthesize through a kind of synoptic view, which I think in the case of Festac would be impossible. Mm-hmm. We realized that very quickly.
Yeah, because there's also, I mean, a way in which the sequencing of the book itself becomes like the master narrative, right? Like you kind of, it's in the way that a mixtape you listen to from start to finish. And in the case of this book, it's like you kind of have to go from start to finish to kind of be able to understand like what the kind of the argument in some ways is, like, I mean, the
sure.
presentation.
But I think, one of the beauties of the book as a technology is you can jump in at any point. So you can skip tracks, and you can move through it in different ways, and very deliberately. There isn't a kind of there's no index, there's no table of there's a table of contents of sorts, but it's a questionnaire, and its opening gambit is to the Festac participants. So you open the book and there's this set of questions saying "Welcome to Festac," and asking you to articulate your experience, and that's how it begins, and that's very much, I think, the ethos of the thing, which I must give all credit to Chimaranga, because it's their kind of masterstroke of giving a set of instructions that aren't instructions. So hopefully there are many access points for people to relate in different ways.
Questions? Okay, so.
Thank you, David, for sharing your experience working on these publications. So I'd like to actually ask you to elaborate a little more about the process. So for Festac, you talked about how it was impossible to synthesize the material because there was so much of material. So I'm wondering the approach, was this something that Chimaranga had suggested from the beginning? You know, what was the process in terms of coming to this decision? Because I'm also thinking about Chiang Mai's social installation, right, which was also a huge archive that you were working with. And so how was it that you took a different approach, you know, or these two books were different approaches?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I think, the Festac was absolutely led by Chimaranga. It was completely their kind of insistence. I mean, I think it was clear from the start. We were talking, I think, since about 2016 or so, about Festac with them, because it's been an ongoing kind of obsession. But it was the idea that we would do a book in the series in a similar way to books previous was never really. We were sort of, I don't know, we kind of ruefully discussed it at several points, like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing? Oh, we could never do it because our books are a certain way and it just wouldn't work. And Chimaranga have their own way of working, and they also work in publishing, and they have a very kind of elaborate and sophisticated like publishing practice as well. So it totally made sense to follow their lead, because it's really their body of research. And with Chiang Mai, again, the format did have to change, but in much more subtle ways. So I don't have the book to show, but previous books in the series, so although they all follow a similar kind of scheme, with Chiang Mai, for example, we had to break the grid of how the images were presented, to give one slightly technical example of that, because it didn't feel reflective of what those events were, to present them in the way that, for example, Magicien de la Terre was presented in that book. So if we had the two books to compare, you can sort of see how in CMSI the grid starts slipping and slowly goes out of the window as you turn the pages. The images start to float and drift. And it was much more, we worked with the designer very closely as with the image section as much more of a flow of snapshots and voices of moments, which was a kind of, I don't know, in a small way, a practice run for what we did on what Chimaranga were, how they were conceptualizing Festac as well. So there are certain ways that both of these books were pushing against the format, but I think Festac demanded a completely different approach in a way that, with CMSI it was perhaps it could have been pushed further in various ways, and it would be interesting post Festac coming back to CMSI to think about how we might have approached it differently as well, because I think what the book does, perhaps interestingly, is to re-inflect what the books were doing before, but I think now, I think certainly post book 10, there is a real desire on all of our parts within the kind of editorial group to keep pushing in different directions. So hopefully it will be occasion to rethink over and over again. I don't know if that answered your question very directly, but yeah.
Thank you, David. I have a question about the evolution and the future direction of the exhibition history series itself, because the series starts with single or individual exhibitions, and towards the end you start looking at two exhibitions. Okay. Towards the end, there are more multiple events together, and I believe with the next edition, you're going to look at a number of exhibitions that were not necessarily connected to each other. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the direction?
Sure. I mean, direction is perhaps too strong a way to put it. I think there's the way, I mean, particularly with the last couple of books, but the books have always sort of rethought themselves in quite subtle ways each time, depending on their kind of object of study. But certainly there was one of the self-critiques was that these books kind of contribute to a certain kind of canonization of like landmarks, which was never really. I don't think it was ever really part of the plan. But when you make a book about something, it inevitably canonizes, and you can push against canons and invert them and complicate them. But one of the guiding ideas behind the book post-Festac on Shanghai initiatives is to take a different approach and more look at what was going on in a particular place in a particular time and what that means more broadly. So what emerges in that particular place at that particular time across like exhibitionary activity writ large. So there is a biennale. There's a reason we're looking at Shanghai in that year. There's the third edition of the biennale, which was significant in terms of the sort of local articulations of the global, quote unquote global, which connects to these threads I was talking about before. But there's also the sort of culmination of artist-led initiatives that were happening at that time, and also a number of kind of para institutional events and initiatives that were all happening as well, and also the kind of development of a domestic and transnational market is another thread to the shifting kind of geographies at that time in relation to that particular locality. So that it's a way, I suppose, of going beyond the singular case study, but the books have always had a kind of case study core, and I don't think they'll lose that in a hurry. I think we're starting to think about ways to broaden that remit slightly, or like approach the case study in a way that doesn't sort of close it down in a canonical way.
Yeah, it's interesting actually to follow up on that, the way that the discussions within the editorial board have, been very aware of, the kind of the direction or the kind of the inflections of each volume, and kind of listening to your thoughts on, collectively about this has been really interesting as well. Questions? Are there questions? Yeah.
Just a vague question, I guess, about I work in a university, and the students have changed from wanting to be artists and stuff to being curators in the last 20 years. There's a big demand for students to study curatorial methodologies. To what extent do you see this series of books contributing to art history, number one, and secondly to curatorial studies as these two different disciplines existing within universities?
That's a really good question, and it reminds me of something I think I forgot to say, which is that the series is also one of the things that feeds into and draws from the program of books and research is a research master's program in the university, which I recently started co-leading with a colleague, Elena Villalta, and that program is called Exhibition Studies, so it's not curatorial studies or art history, it's exhibition studies. And the students often ask me this question, like, why is this not art history, or what's the difference, or how does this relate to kind of curatorial practice? And I think the short answer, the curatorial, the sort of various articulations of the curatorial, I think, have the potential to reinscribe a kind of authorship that hopefully exhibition histories and studies when done in the way we are trying, pushes against that a little bit. So it's not about moving away from the kind of authorial artist figure towards another kind of authority in the shape of the curator, and it's more about talking about the many pairs of hands that go into the production of art, whether it be the people working in the institution, the people who design the flyers and the printed matter, to the kind of the broader set of like institutional and social conditions. So I think that's one of the differences in scope between art history, curatorial, and exhibition studies and histories. That's where I would cite exhibition studies and histories on that sort of continuum. It's always a sort of, it depends what kind of art history, I think, and what kind of curatorial approach one is interested in as well, because there's a million points of overlap and crossover, which I guess is worth emphasizing as well. But that would be the exhibition histories corner of that kind of space is more is more focused on a kind of discursive collective experience and encounter with the work.
This is sort of an impossible question, but do you have a favorite book from the series?
I have two favorites.
Oh.
And they happen to be the ones I've been talking about today.
Can you say a little more why?
It's so funny, you know, whenever you read an interview with a musician, or I mean, most people, it's always like, which is your favorite album? It's always, oh yeah, the one that I'm like promoting right now. Happens to be the one that we're talking about. But it's genuinely true. I think that so in very different ways, I felt enormously lucky to be working with the people we were working with on both of these books. So for CMSI, as I said, it was the product of many people, and certainly not just David Tay and myself, and drew on a much larger body of research, and I think was opened a lot of doors in terms of how all of us thought about what was possible through this series of books. And similarly with Festac, it was just a pleasure and an amazing kind of journey developing this book with Chimamanda, and endlessly fascinating, and introduced me to an enormous number of people who I wouldn't have otherwise known, and practices and histories that I wasn't previously aware of. And I mean, it really gathered a kind of community of practice around its kind of around that process. So it kind of like as it went forward, it gathered a lot of momentum and different contributions from all over, and also innumerable tangents. As I said, like this, it's good that it did come out. It could have lasted another 10 years, could have lasted another 100 years. The amount of things that would constantly come up that we were like, okay, well, we need to spend some time really getting to the bottom of this sort of these video workshops that were happening between Norway and Lagos, or any number of other things that sort of came up along the way. So both of these books were incredible projects to work on. And my favorites.
Do you have one last question for Ingrid? Okay, one last question.
It's a two-parter. I guess I can say, being a product of a curatorial education, since coming back to Hong Kong, thinking, and of course that's a process of learning, but it's been actually a long process of unlearning maybe some of those histories and some of those processes of exhibition making. This is in some ways a product of that, the library, and the way, and personally how I think through spaces of where art meets publics, and how we can share, be in a process of dialogue and things that aren't exhibitions all the time. But in thinking about that, I wondered whether or not it seems like in, let's say, tracking your two most recent publications, do you see that happening in reverse, in sharing, like maybe histories of Chiang Mai, histories of Chamaranga and what they're sharing, that's also working in reverse in terms of who's reading them, who's learning? Is that your aim, sort of, with some of these books? And then I was wondering whether or not any of them are translated in any other languages. So, two-parter.
Okay. The second part first. The short answer is no, and we. In the case of, one thing to say about the Festac book, it's in multiple languages already, so bar a couple of examples, most of the text is presented in its original language. Much of it is English, but there's also some stuff was translated into Arabic for the book. There's French, Portuguese, and several other languages besides. In the case of the CMSI book, we really want it to be translated into Thai, and there have been some preliminary conversations along that line, which is very exciting. But I think, with the book Cultural Anthropophagy on the 1998 Binal Sabalo. There has been a long-term plan also to translate that into Portuguese, and I think our ideal would be to have all of the books available in multiple languages, and sadly due to a question of resources that's not currently possible, but it's definitely a priority. Okay, the question of reversal. So, can you recap the first question? I lost it.
I guess what it comes down, to paraphrase, sort of in being educated, I guess, in a certain way, in a certain mode of exhibition practice, and then coming back to the region, sort of unpacking and unlearning and thinking through possibilities for shaping through exhibitions or other ways practices that are happening regionally, for example. And I guess maybe it comes down to your books. Is there an ideal audience? Is sort of what are you hoping for them to learn or to receive? Because you're also, I guess, in reverse, sharing some of the local, not local, but other forms of exhibition making, other forms of practices, and I wonder if there's maybe responses you've had to the books, or and maybe a perceived audience, or what you're hoping to share with people.
Okay, it's a really it's a question we ask ourselves a lot, and one of the issues we've been struggling with actually recently is distribution. So one of the real privileges of working with Chimaranga, and I should also mention that the Festac book, as well as Asia Art Archive and Bard College, institutional collaborations, was also produced in collaboration with Raw Material Company in Dakar. And so we're very lucky to be able to connect with their networks in terms of distribution, and because this book needs to be read in a Pan-African context above all. That would be, I think, our ideal audience. However, our existing distribution networks are primarily in Europe and the US, and we're pushing very hard to change that. And often the best way to do that is to literally carry books around with you. And yeah, similarly in the case of Chiang Mai social installation, it was a case of having a suitcase full of books and going to Chiang Mai with them in order to get the books to the people who were involved. And so, yeah, we're ever working on ways to reach more localized audiences, and audiences that hopefully, we never even thought of. And certainly, translation is a crucial part of that, as well as online publishing more material that's available. I think, is another avenue we're trying to explore, and making more things available for free.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, David, for this fascinating presentation on Afterall and also the exhibition histories in your work with this series. Please join me in giving a round of applause to David. And to jump back to Michelle's point about favorite children or favorite books, I do want to point out the Festac volume was named one of the art books of 2019 by the New York Times recently. And so, we have copies for sale in the back. And also for the artist-to-artist volume. So take a look, and if you're interested, please pick up a copy. And David will also be speaking this weekend at the Exhibition Making Practices in China and Southeast Asia conference, the third assembly that's taking place at the Times Museum. So if you're interested in exhibition histories and want to learn more, you can join both of us and a few other people there as well this weekend at the Times Museum in Guangzhou. Okay. Thank you.